And I am excited and delighted as always to come to you to bring to you information that I believe can be very helpful for you. Now, I am a nutritionist, an author, a researcher, a person who cares, and that's why I share. I have been dubbed America's Fat Loss Coach, and we have done 2 evidence-based clinical trials to demonstrate the effectiveness of our diet-free life methodology. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the methodology. I am going to share with you information that I believe can make a huge difference in helping you as an individual better understand the role of processed foods. And it's going to help coaches because I would be willing to bet that they don't have the information that I'm about to share with you. So if you have a good 20 minutes to stick with me, then my goal is to kind of share with you some background, some science that brings clarity to why and how processed food can interfere with your ability to lose weight. Okay. Now, before I go into the details of that, I want to remind you, if you're hearing this for the first time, that 88% of adults in North America are not medically or metabolically fit. Indeed, they are metabolically unfit because a large majority of people are experiencing insulin resistance, and there's like 7 levels of that. And when you have insulin resistance, weight loss can be really tough. But what many people aren't aware of is that insulin resistance, when you have it, we're talking 88% of adults, that was not as a result of something you did last week. That is a result of something that you did 10, 15, 20 plus years ago. And that's one of the reasons why weight loss becomes more and more difficult as we mature in age. Now, to help me teach this, let's go over one quick thing, and then my goal is to share my screen with you so that I can walk you through a presentation to bring clarity to how and why processed food blocks weight loss. Now, if you're new, if you're catching me on YouTube, make sure you comment. Let me know where you're from. Give me your 2 cents. Post any questions that you have, and I'll do the best I can to get back to you and provide answers. If you're on Facebook or any other social media platform, do me a favor and share because you care. Don't keep the positive, amazing, uplifting information to yourself. As Jack LaLanne told me face to face in the living room of his house, he says, Robert, whenever you're excited about anything, don't keep it a secret. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that was a big part of his whole message was, I'm not going to be quiet about things that matter. And this is something that I don't want to be quiet about because my goal is to give you the right information that's going to help you make the right decisions, that's going to put you in a place where you can thrive with your overall health. All right, so let's get down to this. So again, the title of this moment right now is called How and Why Processed Food Blocks Weight Loss. Now, in order for this to all make a ton of sense, what I am going to attempt is to share my screen. And as I share my screen, I want you to do me a favor and comment and let me know if you can see my screen, because we're going to go into a little bit of science, and that's what's going to help make all of this make more sense. Okay, so if you can hear me, if you can see my screen and all is going well, then I want you to say, Robert, I can see your screen and all is going well. And as a result of all going well, then we will just keep it moving. Now, there's this thing called the Incretin Effect, and it's a primary driver for insulin response. Now, as I share with you this information, I want you to understand, and I'm going to go back and forth here because I want to make sure that we are totally getting all of this. And that is, I want you to like fully get what I'm sharing because we are going to be doing a presentation. So as you can see, my PowerPoint, let's go back and let's get this set up so we do it right. I apologize. We got some difficulties here, but Let me know that you can see my screen. And if you can, then I'm going to jump right into it. Okay. So if you can see my screen, then let me know so I can jump into it, because it's important that you can see what I'm sharing. And I'm in studio by myself today, so I don't have any help to help position me to make sure I'm giving you everything that you need. So once I have confirmation that you can see my screen, then I will move forward. Other than that, let's begin and get a better understanding of what we mean by processed foods, since we're talking about processed foods. So processed foods, if you looked at an apple, that's not processed food. I will move forward. Um, so that's not processed food. But when the apple becomes applesauce, now we're talking processed food. When the apple becomes apple juice, we're talking processed foods. And whenever a food is processed, no matter what is made up of, you have an increased likeliness of stimulating an insulin response. And as a result of stimulating that insulin response, whenever insulin is secreted, especially at high levels, insulin, being the hormone that it is, will block you from being able to lose weight. And we're talking to up to 4 hours. And there have been studies that demonstrated up to 6 hours where insulin could be elevated. And as a result of insulin being elevated, I don't care what you're doing as far as cutting calories, how you're counting, it's going to be hell losing weight. Now, to understand why all this works the way it works, let's look at some of the basics of food. When you eat food, it enters your stomach, and that food will make its way down in your small intestine to this area where you have these K cells, and they're like very dense. There's a whole bunch of them there. And as you can see here, the K cells, that teardrop, that's kind of horizontal, and it secretes these things called incretins. And the incretins, there's two main incretins here. We have GIP, which stands for glucose dependent insulinotropic polypeptide. And then we have one that's called GLP-1, and that stands for glucagon like peptide 1. Well, when those incretins are secreted, as you can see here, because you eat the food, and let's say that food is processed or not, when it gets down to that dense population of K cells, incretins get secreted from the K cells, and these incretins communicate with the pancreas. And it's in that pancreas where we have our beta cells, alpha cells. This is where insulin is stored, and this is where it comes from. And insulin, like a key, when you're younger or when everything is working great, as far as glucose being able to enter the cells and there's no insulin resistance, you only need one key, right? So you only need a little bit of insulin. But over time, you start to need more and more and more insulin to get the job done, meaning helping with metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And there's a whole bunch that we could spend time talking about, but it's important. And I'm going to come back to this slide at the very end, right? So when you eat food, it goes down the small intestine, it comes across these cells. These cells then stimulate the secretion of incretins, and the incretins communicate through this thing called enteroinsular axis with the pancreas and tell the pancreas to secrete insulin. This will be a game changer. Okay, so let's bring some clarity to this because oftentimes we're so stuck on the fact that insulin is secreted because of glucose. And that is true. And most people are thinking that it's glucose in the blood. But as I just demonstrated to you, it wasn't about the glucose in the blood. It was about this thing called the incretin effect. And that all takes place in your small intestine. And I would be willing to bet everything that your doctor has never shared this with you, because most physicians, and I do a lot of talks to physicians, are not aware of this. Most nutritionists, dietitians are not aware of this, because we live in this world where everything is based on glucose, where the focus really needs to shift to being primarily focused on insulin response and not glucose response. So glucose is sugar. And because everyone's looking at sugar all the time, we have this thing called the glycemic index. We have the glycemic load, and everybody's talking sugar, sugar, sugar. But sugar is not the only thing that you eat that will cause an insulin response. Matter of fact, if you eat protein, it stimulates an insulin response, but nowhere near the level of just sugar or carbohydrates. And fat, even fat by itself will stimulate an insulin response, but very little, nowhere near carbs. But there's one that when you eat foods together, if you're doing it the wrong way, which I'll explain, it can stimulate a very large insulin response. So let me show you what I mean. If you ate a hamburger patty, okay, compared to fruit, which one of these two foods is going to cause the greater insulin response? Most people, and we've done surveys on this, where 100% of 100 people, right, all said that the fruit will stimulate the greater insulin response because they're thinking sugar. In reality, the hamburger patty is going to stimulate the higher insulin response. And why is that? It's because the hamburger patty is processed. You don't cut out meat and have a hamburger from a cow. It gets mushed together, they create a patty, and then we eat it. So that means whatever it was pulled apart, then put back together, that's processed. If I go and eat a strawberry and it's in its natural state, it's not processed. So here is a prime, easy, simple example that it can't just be about glucose. We know for a fact that the hamburger patty stimulates the higher insulin response compared to the fruit. We know that. And when we look at the glycemic index and we look at the insulin response, well, first, let's look at the glucose response. An apple, which is not processed, is at 38 on the glycemic index. Apple juice, same amount of carbs in the apple, same amount of carbs in the apple juice. The apple juice is 41. So this is pretty much the same. So if we only look at sugar, if we only look at carbs, it's about the same. And that's where the mindset is for most physicians, dietitians, nutritionists, people walking around, consumers. Everything is about carbs. Everything is about the glycemic index. Everything is about the glycemic load. And they're associating glucose, they're associating sugar with insulin. Well, if you look at the insulin response of the same amount of carbs in an apple, same amount of carbs, in the apple juice, the processed food, because the apple is processed, whether you do it at home or whether you get it out, whether you added sugar to it or not, everything is the same as far as grams of carbs. The insulin response with the apple juice, because it's no longer in its natural state, is way up high compared to the apple. The structural integrity is in place when it's not processed. So drinking the apple juice, the same amount of carbs, I'm going to get a much higher insulin response. And that's important to know because it's the insulin response that is creating all the problems. It's the insulin response over years that is putting you in a position where you experience things like PCOS and fatty liver, heart disease, migraines, high blood pressure, elevated triglycerides. When you look into it, it's the insulin response over years because no one's testing for it. Your doctor's not looking at your fasting insulin. Your doctor is not talking about insulin. They talk about carbs. They're doing a hemoglobin A1C. They're asking and checking on your fasting glucose. They are not, hear me, people, They are not looking at your insulin, and that is the cause. Glucose, for the most part, is an effect. It's a symptom. And so we get so focused on treating the symptom, we never, ever reverse the cause. And if you only treat the system, guess what? You're chasing the effects. You will never catch the effects. This is real. This is real. Now, when I said earlier how you have 3 macronutrients, right? You have fat, protein, and carbs. When a person eats fat, let's say you just ate a little bit of fat, you get a little bump in insulin, just a little bit, if any at all. And let's say that later on you ate just pure protein, you get a little bit more of a bump, right? So the insulin response is a little bit more than it would be if it was fat. If you ate just only carbs, no fat, no protein, you get the higher bump. But when you eat something that's rich in carbohydrates, fats, and is processed, you get the biggest bump. And every time you get that response in insulin, right, that puts you in a position where it's hell. It is a struggle to lose weight. And most people, again, are not looking at the insulin response. They're eating based on glucose. So everything they're doing with weight loss is all based on glucose and not insulin. So people talk about insulin, but they don't quite get it because they lead with glucose. And there's a whole bunch of things I could share with you on why I believe we are where we are. And a lot of it is because we have not looked at the history to how we got to where we are. And as the saying goes, if you don't know your history, then you will repeat it. And that's what's taking place. People don't know what I'm sharing with you. And when you look at those processed foods, and I'm not saying you never eat these processed foods, but when you are focused and engaged and you understand what your level of insulin resistance is, because it pertains to 88% of the population, then we can actually help you eat in a way where you're eating to keep your body in what we refer to as fat burning mode instead of carb burning mode. Okay. And that's a whole nother talk. But let me take you back to the early 1960s. In the early 1960s, they did a test in Denver at the medical group university, and they wanted to see what the glucose response. So I'm not talking about insulin right now. I'm talking about glucose. What the glucose response is when a person consumed 50 grams of glucose. And they saw this bump and they tracked it over a 3-hour period. Then what they did is, because the first time that was all based on what they consumed in their mouth. And then they decided, let's see what the response will be by IV, intravenous, right? We're going to go right into the blood and just inject it right there. And they expected if it goes directly into the blood, then we're going to see a bigger spike. Well, as you can see here, whether you were injected with the glucose or whether you consume the glucose response was the same. Now, then they said, let's look at the insulin response. And so they first injected by IV, and they expected if we go directly into the blood, we're definitely going to see a bigger insulin response because it's going to be immediate because we're thinking glucose. Well, not that big of a response. And so then they said, well, let's take the same amount of carbs and let's consume it orally. It's definitely not, maybe it's going to be the same or it'll be lower. And to their surprise, it was much higher. And that is when they were like, what? This is interesting. Because when we looked at the glucose response, whether it was oral or whether it was injected, the glucose response was the same. But when we looked at the culprit, the cause, the insulin, look at the difference. And this is the Incretin effect that I open up this conversation with. You have this Incretin effect. And remember, the incretins communicate with the pancreas, though they're not attached. And the incretins tell the pancreas how much insulin to secrete. Now, glucose does the same thing, but the incretins are not talked about. They're not talked about. So when you look at the top, you can see the glucose response. And if we just look at glucose, we can see that an apple and the apple juice are basically the same based on glucose. But when we look down at the bottom and you look at the insulin response, there's a difference. And this is what we got to get people to know this. This is the game changer. This is what a person benefits from when they work with someone like myself or any of my coaches who are trained on all of this. We are cutting edge, way ahead of everybody. We have labs and clinics. They're all reaching out, wanting to understand how to help their community, their patients, their consumers, and how to bring them into the 21st century. This is it, you guys. This is it. Glucose response is not the answer. We got to get away from that and focus on the insulin response. So back to our opening. You eat food, it goes into the stomach. And then it travels through the small intestine and it comes across these K cells. And these K cells, when the food touches it, based on what I just shared with you, the more processed it is, the bigger the response. You see this like horizontal teardrop, it secretes these incretins, right? So you got the K cells, you got the incretins, and then the incretins, which we talked about, GIP and GLP-1, they communicate with the pancreas through this thing called enteroinsular axis. And as a result of that, those incretins tell the pancreas how much insulin to secrete. The more processed a food is, the more insulin response you're going to get. And the more frequent you're going to get it. Are you with me? Now, I hope that made sense. And if it didn't make sense, we'll do more. We'll talk about it again. But there are a lot of people who are insulin resistant. And the reason they got there, okay, so I'm going to share this with you. Okay, check this out. Hear me on this. Go back to when you were 20, 22, 25, 18, and think about the moments that you ate processed food. So whether it was a pack of M&Ms, or I had some Doritos, or I was drinking grape soda, or I was eating a donut, or I was getting something from the store that was crunchy, whether it's Whoppers. Every time you eat those foods, you get an insulin response. And no one is testing or checking, observing the insulin response. Your doctor is not checking that. You have this insulin response and it's elevated. Now, you may not be gaining weight at the moment because your metabolism, maybe your activity, there's many things that play a role here. But when you have elevated levels of insulin for years, 5, 10, 15 years, you turn 40, 45, you go to your doctor and they go, hey, we noticed that your glucose is starting to get up there. You have signs of being pre-diabetic. You go, oh, so now you start focusing on the glucose. They don't even mention the insulin. They're not even looking at that. And you haven't for the last 20 years. Every time you went in for a checkup, they didn't look at your insulin. And then you get these migraines or your blood pressure just out of nowhere. And then they say, well, we think it's you. If you lost a little bit of weight, then your blood pressure will be better. No, it's the insulin, the elevated levels of insulin that has either caused or exasperated the condition that you don't want. It's insulin. Talk to any of my clients. Last year, in 2021, I personally helped 53 people get off metformin because we understand the role of insulin. We helped 33 people get off high blood pressure medication because we focus on the insulin response and not glucose or anything else. We helped quite a few people lose over 50 plus pounds. Already in 2022, in the second week of January, we have my first client who had been on high blood pressure medication for 17 years and no longer. And when you think about all the people who are taking blood pressure medication, all the people who are taking metformin and a lot of these medications, those medications have been recommended and are being used for the effect, the symptom, because we're still not addressing the cause. If you don't reverse the cause, you will forever chase the effects. You will not catch the effects. So, am I asking you or telling you to never eat processed food? No. But it does feel pretty good to know this. It does feel pretty good. And if you find out that you're insulin resistant, once you know, we can real quickly tell you what level of insulin resistance you have. There's 7. Or if you're insulin sensitive. And when you're insulin sensitive, that means that everything is working. If you're working well, meaning insulin is helping with the with your ability to metabolize carbs, fat, and protein. There's no major resistance in the cells. That would be great. That's sensitive. If you're resistant, then it can start with the fat cells, the muscle cells, and eventually it gets harder and harder for nutrients to make it into your cells. Well, knowing where you are, because it's hard to improve any part of where you are, you must first know where you are. We have a quick and easy way for you to know. And once you know, oh, preach, Robert. Once you know, then you got the game plan. Let's go. Once you know, let's go. Now, I know I had a couple questions that came in live, and let me see if I can answer a couple of them. Someone said, so no, wouldn't share it even if they knew it. Well, actually, I've shared this with many physicians, and many of them have changed their entire practice after they learned this and they looked up all of the stats and the data. They are like, they get it. Okay. Let me see. Someone asked a question, or does the ground beef become processed when it's cooked? No. The brown, okay. If you've ever seen how bacon is made, it is never deconstructed, right? It's never broken up into something else and then put back together, right? They cut the meat. It's kind of like steak. So steak isn't processed because they cut the meat that way, and it's still in its natural state, and then you cook it. But hamburger patty, turkey patty, soy patty, all the patties, they are made up of a whole bunch of stuff. So it's broken up. Sometimes they take various types of meat and then they create the patty. That's processed. Remember, an apple is in its natural state. Apple juice, even if you made it yourself, is processed. And I know there's a lot of people that say, well, we got the best juice and juicing is real popular and juicing is healthy for you. Okay, but it's processed. And for some people, they can eat that process because maybe they are insulin sensitive. And when you're insulin sensitive, you're more of a fat burner. And when you're more of a fat burner, you can eat some of these things that some people can't eat because they have insulin resistance. So if you have insulin resistance, then you don't want to be drinking apple juice. Now, if I'm insulin sensitive and I want to get a burst of nutrients, okay, I'm insulin sensitive. So it's not going to cause that much of a negative for me because of how my body is working. But if you're not insulin sensitive, I get it. You're looking at that person who's pretty healthy. They look fit and they're drinking the juice. And you're like, well, I'm going to drink the juice because it's working for them. That's where they are. You have to meet you where you are. We're all at a different place. That's why, like, what works for one doesn't work for another. And the science is clear. You cannot argue what I just shared with you. It's like indisputable. You can't argue what I just shared. It just that most people don't know it because the world that we live in is all framed around carbohydrates. Avoid the carbs. Do this diet because there's no carbs. The carbs is the problem. Again, the symptom is dictating all of the solutions. It's chasing the effects, and you're not going to catch the effects. For most of us, most of you hearing me right now, You have to grab the bull by the horns. Enough is enough. Give yourself time, and I'll end on this. I have had many clients who were an extreme high level of insulin resistance. They were primarily burning carbs for fuel, so they were a carb burner. If they looked at it, what I call a fast carb, if they looked at a pastry, they would gain weight. Once we knew where they were, then we gave them the plan for where they were, and they stayed the course. And many of those people are no longer insulin resistant. They're now insulin sensitive. They literally eat certain carbs that they couldn't even look at for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not gain a pound, and continue to drop the weight. Boom. There you go. I've been wanting to share this with you guys for a while. So thank you for tuning in. Please comment, share, share with other people. Sorry for the rough start, but we will be back. So processed foods is not what they're made up of necessarily. Because a lot of people say, oh, it has too many carbs in it. No. It's processed. Okay. And then they have like ultra processed. And then there's other levels of process, right? Because apple juice is more processed than applesauce. You with me? Like if I looked at regular bacon, that's less, that's like really not even processed. I mean, it's processed because oftentimes they cure it, etc. And it goes through what it goes through before it's in that package and you buy it and then go home and eat it. I would rather eat regular bacon that's uncured because that's nowhere near processed as soy bacon or turkey bacon or chicken bacon. What is that turkey bacon made up of? It's not like they cut the turkey and then that strip is the turkey. No, it gets grounded, then it gets pressed into strips that look like bacon. That's way more processed than just regular bacon, Canadian bacon, that you cut it, hang it up, give it time, and then it's ready to be enjoyed. There you have it. Thank you guys for being here. I'm Robert Ferguson. Please share if you care, because I know you care. So just share and tell people about what we're doing. And I'll be back for the next.